Hello and welcome, dear listeners. You are now tuned in to Shadow Storyteller, a place where real-life moments and unforgettable encounters turn into stories to reflect upon before sleep. If you enjoy these narratives, don't forget to subscribe, press the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories for you every night. Now, let me take you into a memory, one that begins in the heart of Washington, D.C., where history lingers at every corner, and sometimes strangers leave you with words you never forget. It was a late autumn afternoon, around the end of October. The air carried a crisp bite, and the golden light of the sinking sun stretched long shadows across the National Mall. I had been walking near the reflecting pool, not far from the Lincoln Memorial, when I noticed an elderly man seated on a wooden bench. His figure was still, but there was something in the way he held himself, straight-backed, hands resting on a cane. A quiet dignity that seemed to anchor him against the passing world. His name, as I later learned, was Edward Thompson, though he introduced himself simply as Ed. He wore a dark wool coat that had clearly seen many winters, and a flat cap rested low on his head. His eyes, though pale with age, carried a sharpness that made you pause before speaking. When I first approached, I only meant to rest my legs. Yet somehow, a simple greeting turned into a conversation that unfolded slowly, like pages of a book being revealed one by one. Ed was a veteran. He had served during the Vietnam War, though he didn't speak of it with the fiery pride one might expect. Instead, he spoke with measured pauses, as if weighing each memory before letting it leave his lips. The hum of distant traffic, the soft rustling of leaves, and the muted voices of tourists became a backdrop to his story. "I was 19 when I first set foot in Saigon," he began, his voice low but steady. 19, barely old enough to know who I was, but old enough to carry a rifle and follow orders. Funny thing, isn't it? I sat in silence, letting him continue. He told me of the heat, the rain, the endless green of the jungle that hid both life and death. He spoke of friends he made and lost, in weeks that felt longer than years. He never raised his voice, but every word seemed to carry the weight of decades. What struck me most, however, wasn't just the hardship. It was the loneliness he admitted carried on long after the war ended. "You come home, people thank you for your service," he said, glancing at the horizon. "But sometimes they don't want to hear the truth of what you saw, so you keep it inside, year after year, until one day, you find yourself talking to a stranger on a bench." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a quiet resignation, softened by the faintest trace of a smile. The evening light deepened, and the city around us seemed to slow. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a marching band rehearsing carried across the air, mingling with the calls of birds preparing for the night. I realized then that this chance meeting was not something ordinary. I asked him if he came to that bench often. He chuckled softly. "Most days, yes. My wife used to love this spot. She passed a few years back, but I still come here. Feels like she's sitting with me when I do." And so, the story began to stretch further, weaving threads of love, loss, and the enduring search for meaning after the battles have ended. The lamps along the pathways flickered on as twilight deepened, spilling circles of soft light onto the gravel paths. I could see the silhouettes of joggers passing, tourists snapping their final photographs before nightfall, and families gathering their children to head home. Yet on that wooden bench, time seemed to slow down, tethered by the quiet voice of a man who had seen far too much and yet was still willing to share. Ed leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the knob of his cane. His knuckles were thick and scarred, a map of a life that had been shaped by more than just age. He seemed to sense my unspoken curiosity, for he began again without me having to prompt him. "You know," he said, "when my wife, Margaret, was alive, she was the one who anchored me. I used to wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the sounds of helicopters in my head. She'd be there, just holding my hand, no words. Sometimes silence is the only medicine that works." His words hung in the air, softened by the cool breeze drifting across the reflecting pool. I tried to imagine the life of this man, returning from war to a world that could not understand him, saved only by the steadfast love of someone waiting at home. He took a slow breath, eyes tracing the outline of the Washington Monument, which glowed faintly in the distance. Margaret and I met before I shipped out. I was in basic training down in Georgia, and she was a nurse in a small-town hospital. We wrote letters every week. She told me once that she would smell the paper just to imagine a little piece of me had traveled across the ocean with it. Can you believe that? A man out there in the jungle, and a woman at home, keeping hope alive with nothing more than ink on a page. His voice broke slightly at the edges, though he quickly steadied himself. When I came home, I wasn't much to look at. Skinny, hollow-eyed, jittery as a cat. But she never looked at me with pity. She just loved me back into being human. The bench creaked as he shifted, settling deeper into memory. The sounds of the city faded for me. I was caught inside the world he was painting. I used to think I owed her more than I could ever repay, he continued. We had 46 years together. 46. That's longer than some people get in life altogether. She passed on a cold morning in January. Cancer. By then she was smaller than a shadow. You never forget the way someone looks when they fought so hard. And you know they can't fight anymore. You hold on. But then you have to let go. He fell quiet. And for a moment, the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant laughter of a group walking past. I wanted to reach out, to offer something, but words felt clumsy in the presence of such a truth. Instead, I asked him softly, "Is that why you come here to this bench?" Ed gave a slow nod. She liked the water, the way it reflected everything. She said it reminded her that life was about balance. You see the monument, the sky, the clouds all in the pool, but you know it's not the real thing. It's a reflection. Maybe that's what memory is too. Just reflections of people we loved. His words carried a wisdom I wasn't prepared for. I found myself staring into the pool as well, the surface rippling with the faintest breeze, breaking the images into fragments. As the hour grew later, fewer people passed by. The hush of evening settled in, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic from Constitution Avenue. The city was preparing for night, but for us, the bench was still alive with the echoes of the past. Ed smiled faintly then, as if sensing my heaviness. "Don't mistake me, son," he said, his voice regaining a touch of strength. "I'm not just sitting here drowning in sadness. Margaret would have hated that. I come here because I like to remember her in the light. Sometimes I'll tell her about my day. Sometimes I just sit. And sometimes, like tonight, I get lucky enough to share my story with someone who's willing to listen." I felt a warmth in my chest at his words. It was not just a story he was giving me. It was a gift of trust, something strangers rarely exchange in a city as busy as Washington. Curious, I asked him, "Do you meet many people like this? People who sit and talk?" He chuckled quietly. "Not many. Most pass by, eyes on their phones, ears plugged with music. Every now and then, a tourist stops, or someone looking for a place to rest. Sometimes, they'll sit for 5 minutes and go. Sometimes, they stay a little longer. It depends. Life's about who's willing to take the time." I nodded, realizing how rare this moment truly was. The air had grown colder, and I could see Ed's breath misting faintly in front of him. I offered to walk him somewhere warmer, but he shook his head. "No, this is my place. I'll head home soon enough, but not yet." There was something steady, almost ritualistic, in the way he said it. Then, unexpectedly, he told me of another memory. Not of war, nor of loss, but of simple joy. "Margaret loved Sunday mornings," he said, eyes twinkling with the faintest light. "We'd walk to a bakery down on 14th Street. They sold the flakiest croissants you've ever had. We'd bring them back home, make coffee, and sit on the porch. That was our church in a way. Just being together, breaking bread, sharing silence. You never realize, until it's gone, how holy those little moments are." His words struck me deeply, because they reminded me of my own life, of the people I had perhaps taken for granted. As night fully descended, the lights of the Lincoln Memorial glowed like a beacon. The city was quieter now, tourists having left, and the hum of evening traffic softening. Yet our bench still held a weight that kept me anchored. I didn't want the conversation to end. It felt like a story that wasn't finished, like a book with pages still waiting to be turned. Ed must have sensed my reluctance. He gave me a long, thoughtful look, then said, "You'll carry this with you, whether you know it or not. Sometimes the stories of strangers stick closer than the stories of friends. And maybe one day, you'll pass it on, sitting on another bench, talking to someone else who needs to hear it." His words lingered in the cold evening air, settling deep into my memory. I stayed with him a while longer, letting the silence speak, watching the city lights shimmer in the water. But I knew this wasn't the end of what he had to share. There was more, about his life after the war, about how he rebuilt himself, about the people he met along the way. And so I promised him, with nothing more than a quiet nod, that I would return to listen again. The night was only just beginning, and the story of Edward Thompson was far from over. The night in Washington had grown colder, and the streets around the National Mall seemed quieter with every passing minute. The golden light from the monuments stood against the deep blue of the sky, while a soft hum of the city carried from a distance. On that bench, Ed and I sat as if the world had slowed down just for us. I asked him gently about the years after the war, when life returned to a rhythm that civilians assumed was normal. But for men like him, normal was a foreign word. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lamps along the path. Coming home was harder than leaving, he said after a long pause. When I left, I knew I was stepping into chaos. When I came back, I expected peace. But you don't just walk out of war. It follows you. It sits in the corners of your bedroom. It whispers when you try to sleep. It clings to you even in the laughter of friends. He shifted, adjusting his cane, as if steadying himself against memories. For years, I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried jobs here and there. Construction, delivery, even worked in a warehouse for a while. But I'd lose focus. I'd snap at people without meaning to. I had nightmares, too many to count. Then Margaret, she saved me again. She pushed me to go back to school, said I was smarter than I gave myself credit for. She believed in me, even when I didn't. I leaned closer, interested in the turn of his story. So I did, he continued. Went to Georgetown on the GI Bill. Studied history, of all things. Maybe I wanted to understand the bigger picture. To know that what I lived through was part of something larger. I became a teacher eventually. Spent 30 years in classrooms, telling kids about wars they'd only ever see in books. Funny thing is, I think I learned more from them than they ever did from me. His face softened at the memory, and I could almost see him in front of a chalkboard, guiding restless students through the lessons of the past. Teaching saved me, he said simply. And Margaret, she made sure I never slipped too far back into the dark. We built a life. Small house in Arlington, garden in the back, 2 children, a boy and a girl. They're grown now, with families of their own. But when I sit here on this bench, I'm not thinking about being a father or a teacher. I'm thinking about being a husband, because that's the role I miss the most. The way he said it was not with sorrow, but with reverence, as though speaking of a sacred duty. A silence followed, but it was not uncomfortable. Around us, the city carried on. A police car passed slowly on the road nearby, its lights flashing briefly across the trees. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and the cool metal of the monuments. I realized how rare it was to sit with someone who spoke not for effect, not to impress, but simply because the truth demanded to be shared. I asked him what kept him going now, in these later years, when the weight of absence could so easily crush a person. He smiled faintly, tapping the ground with the tip of his cane. Routine, he said. I wake up early, still do. Habit from the army. Make myself breakfast. Read the paper. Sometimes I'll volunteer down at the library. Help kids with their homework. Other times, I come here. You see, when you get older, you learn it's the little rituals that hold you together. Not the grand plans. Not the big victories. Just the small, steady steps. I nodded, understanding more than I expected to. He went on, telling me about friends he had lost not only in battle, but also in the decades after. Men who struggled with demons they couldn't defeat. Some found solace in drink, others in silence that eventually swallowed them whole. His voice grew quieter as he mentioned them, but each name seemed to rest heavily on his heart. "It's strange," he whispered, "to be the one left behind. Survivor's guilt, they call it. Why me? Why not the other guy? But maybe the answer is simple. Maybe I was meant to sit here tonight, talking to you. Life doesn't give us explanations, but it gives us moments. And this is one of them." The lamps above buzzed softly, insects circling around their light. The reflecting pool lay calm, mirroring the monuments and the night sky. I realized then that what Ed was giving me wasn't just a story about war or loss. It was a reflection on how to live, even after the world had broken you. He laughed suddenly, breaking the heaviness. "You know what Margaret used to say about me? She said I had two speeds, too fast and dead stop. She'd always tell me to slow down, to notice the flowers, to enjoy the taste of my food instead of swallowing it like a soldier. She was right, of course. She usually was. I'm still trying to learn that lesson." I smiled, picturing a woman who balanced his edges with warmth. As the hours stretched, I realized we had been sitting there far longer than I intended. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. Some moments were worth more than schedules and notifications. Ed's eyes grew distant again, and his voice lowered. "Sometimes I wonder what people see when they look at me. Just an old man with a cane, taking up space on a bench. But inside, there's a whole life, a war, a love, a story. Most people don't stop long enough to notice. That's the tragedy of our times. We walk past libraries of human experience every day, and never open a single book." The truth of his words struck me harder than I expected. How many stories had I ignored? How many elders had I passed without a second glance, never knowing the weight they carried? We sat in silence for a while, watching the last of the evening light fade completely into night. The air grew sharper, the kind that makes you tuck your hands deeper into your pockets. Finally, I asked him one last question. "Do you think you've made peace with it all? With the war, with life, with losing her?" He breathed out slowly, his eyes fixed on the glowing monument. "Peace is a slippery word. I don't think you ever fully make peace with the things that shaped you. But you learn to live alongside them. You stop fighting them, and instead, you let them walk with you. Margaret used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go. I carry it with me, and that's all right, because it means she's still here, in a way. And maybe when my time comes, I'll sit on another bench, somewhere beyond this world, and she'll be waiting." His words settled into me like stones dropped into water, sending ripples through my thoughts. The clock on my watch showed it was nearly 10. The mall was nearly empty now, only the occasional footsteps echoing through the night. I knew it was time to leave, yet I didn't want to. Ed rose slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. I stood too, ready to walk with him, but he shook his head gently. "This is where we part for tonight. You've listened more than most would. That's enough." He extended his hand, rough and strong despite the years. I shook it firmly, feeling the weight of gratitude in the gesture. As I walked away, I turned back once to see him still there, a solitary figure under the lamp, looking out across the water. The image etched itself into my mind, one I knew I would carry for a long time. The story of Edward Thompson, the veteran on the bench in Washington, D.C., was not finished. It was still unfolding, night after night, with every stranger who paused long enough to listen. And perhaps one day, I would return to hear the next chapter. 2 weeks passed before I returned to that same bench near the reflecting pool. It was early November now, the kind of day when the air carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves and the city seemed wrapped in a muted hush. Tourists still roamed, school groups gathered near the monuments, but there was also a sense of quiet anticipation in the air. Perhaps it was the coming of winter. Perhaps simply the weight of history pressing down on this place. As I approached, I half expected the bench to be empty, but there he was again, Edward Thompson, seated as though he had never left. His flat cap was pulled down against the chill. His cane leaned against his leg, and in his lap lay a folded newspaper. When he saw me, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he said in that steady voice, "I'll be damned. You came back." I sat down beside him, the wooden slats cold beneath me. "I told you I would." He chuckled softly. "Most people say things like that, but they don't follow through. Life gets in the way. But here you are." The reflecting pool shimmered faintly in front of us, the surface broken by a breeze that rippled across it. We sat for a moment without speaking, listening to the shuffle of footsteps behind us, the distant voices of children, the low hum of the city. Ed tapped the newspaper with his finger. You ever notice how the news always focuses on the loudest people? The ones shouting, fighting, making a scene. But the real stories, the ones that matter, are quieter. They happen on benches like this, in kitchens, in the backyards of small houses. Nobody reports those, but they're the ones that shape us. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, as if letting the cool air wake him. When Margaret passed, I thought about selling the house. Too many memories in the walls. But my daughter convinced me to stay. She said, "Dad, the memories aren't haunting you. They're keeping you alive." She was right. Every creak in the floorboards, every drawer in the kitchen, every photo frame on the shelf, it's all part of our story. His voice grew softer, more thoughtful. The thing about love is, it doesn't die with the person. It lingers. It lives in habits, in places, in the way you still pour 2 cups of coffee even though one goes untouched. It's not about moving on. It's about moving forward with the love still inside you. The weight of his words settled between us. A young couple passed by, their laughter spilling into the evening air, their hands entwined. Ed's eyes followed them briefly, and a shadow of longing crossed his face, though not bitterness. "Just memory. Do you know," he said after a pause, "that when I was younger, I thought love was about grand gestures? Flowers, gifts, surprises. But it's not. Love is about showing up every single day, even when you're tired, even when you're angry, even when the world feels like it's falling apart. That's what Margaret taught me. She showed up every day, and because of that, I survived things I shouldn't have. The lamps flickered on as the sun dipped lower. The city shifted around us, but we remained in our little pocket of stillness. I asked him then about his children, curious about the legacy of this man who carried so much within him. His face brightened slightly. My son, Daniel, he's a lawyer now. Lives up in Boston with his wife and 2 boys. Smart kids, sharp as tacks. My daughter, Emily, she stayed closer. She's a nurse, like her mother was. She has a little girl, my granddaughter, who thinks I'm some kind of superhero just because I can still walk up the stairs without falling. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. She doesn't know about the nightmares, the memories, the days I struggled to get out of bed. To her, I'm just Grandpa Ed. And maybe that's the best role I've ever had, because it means I can take all the darkness I lived through and turn it into light for her. I could hear the pride in his voice, the kind of pride that doesn't come from accomplishments or accolades, but from simple presence. As the evening deepened, Ed grew more reflective. He told me about friends he'd lost to time, about reunions with fellow veterans where silence often said more than words, about how the weight of memory grows heavier with age, but also more precious. We're the last keepers of these stories, he said quietly. One day, there'll be no one left who remembers what it smelled like in the jungles, what it felt like to hear choppers overhead, what it meant to come home to a world that had moved on. That's why I talk when people listen, because if I don't, it all disappears. His words struck me deeply. The night wore on, and eventually Ed stood, leaning on his cane. "Come," he said, gesturing toward the path. "Walk with me a while. The legs still work, as long as I don't push them too hard." We walked slowly along the edge of the reflecting pool, the lights of the Lincoln Memorial glowing at the far end. Our footsteps crunched against the gravel, and for a while we didn't speak. It was enough just to move, to share the quiet rhythm of walking beside each other. When we reached the steps of the memorial, he paused, looking up at the massive figure of Lincoln seated in stone. His eyes softened. "I used to bring Margaret here," he said. She loved Lincoln's words, the way he spoke about binding wounds, about mercy. She said it was proof that even in the darkest times, leaders could choose compassion. He took a long breath. We need more of that now. More compassion, less shouting. We stood together in silence, gazing at the monument, the marble gleaming under the lights. The air was cold, but inside me, something felt warmer, steadier. Eventually, we turned back toward the bench. Before parting, Ed placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, but there was a gentleness in his eyes. "Don't forget what we talked about," he said. "Don't rush through life. Notice the small things. And when you find someone worth showing up for every day, hold on tight. That's the real war worth fighting." I promised him I wouldn't forget. And as I walked away into the night, the city buzzing softly around me, I knew that the story of Edward Thompson was now part of me. A story I would carry and pass on, just as he had passed it to me. The bench would still be there, waiting, and perhaps so would he, with more stories to tell. For some lives are not lived in a single chapter, but in a series of moments unfolding quietly, like pages turned by the wind. And I knew I would return again. The first snow of December had fallen over Washington, D.C., softening the sharp edges of the city into a quiet landscape of white. The National Mall, usually buzzing with tourists and joggers, now carried a muted stillness, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the laughter of children throwing snowballs near the trees. The reflecting pool was partly frozen, its surface glistening under the pale winter sun. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck as I walked toward the bench. I wasn't sure if Ed would be there in such cold weather, but something told me he would. He had become part of that place, as if the bench itself belonged to him as much as the city did. Sure enough, there he was, seated on the same spot, bundled in a heavy coat, his cap pulled low, gloves covering his hands. His cane leaned beside him as always. A thin puff of steam escaped his lips with each breath, proof of the stubbornness that kept him out here even in the chill. When he saw me, his face brightened with recognition. "Well, look who braved the cold," he said, his voice carrying both amusement and warmth. "Thought you'd be smart enough to stay indoors." I sat down beside him, brushing snow from the wooden slats. "And miss another story? Not a chance." He chuckled, the sound muffled by the layers of winter. "Careful, you'll spoil me. Not many people come back more than once." The city seemed slower in winter. Cars moved cautiously on nearby streets. Footsteps were fewer, and the monuments stood tall and silent against the gray sky. There was a beauty to the stillness, a kind of reverence that made every sound carry farther. Ed adjusted his gloves and leaned back, eyes scanning the frozen pool. "You know, winter always reminded me of the quiet after battle. When the noise finally stopped, when the guns went silent, there was this strange hush, almost peaceful, but heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. That's what this feels like." His words painted a vivid picture, and I found myself looking at the snow with new eyes. "I used to hate the cold," he continued. "In Vietnam, cold meant rain that never ended. Boots soaked through, clothes sticking to your skin, the kind of damp that crawled into your bones and stayed there. But here, in Washington, winter is different. It's honest. Cold here doesn't hide. It's sharp, clear. It tells you exactly what it is. I can respect that." We sat quietly for a while, letting the crisp air surround us. A group of students walked past, their teacher pointing toward the Lincoln Memorial, voices echoing faintly before fading into the distance. I asked Ed if winter had always meant reflection for him, or if it was something he'd grown into with age. He thought about it for a moment before answering. "When you're young, winter is just an inconvenience. Snow to shovel, roads to slip on. But when you get older, you start seeing it differently. Winter is a teacher. It reminds you that everything slows down, everything rests. The trees, the animals, even people if they're wise enough. You learn that life isn't just about growth and movement. It's also about stillness. His breath clouded the air as he spoke, curling upward like faint smoke. I suppose that's what I'm doing now, he said softly. Learning to be still, to sit with my memories, to let them breathe instead of chasing them away. Margaret used to say I was always running, even when I was sitting still. She'd be glad to know I finally learned how to stop. There was a pause, filled only by the distant bark of a dog and the soft rustle of branches. I asked him what he thought about legacy, about what we leave behind. His eyes grew distant, reflecting the pale light of the snow. Legacy, he repeated, tasting the word. People think it's about buildings with your name on them, or money, or some great achievement. But that's not it. Legacy is in the small things. It's in the stories your children tell about you, the habits your grandchildren pick up without realizing. It's in the kindness you gave a stranger, or the way you made someone feel seen when the world ignored them. That's legacy. It's the ripple effect of being alive. His words sank into me, each one a quiet weight. I don't care if history remembers my name, he continued. What I care about is whether my children remember I love them, whether my students remember I believed in them, whether my wife remembered that I showed up every day until her last breath. That's enough for me. Snowflakes began to fall again, drifting lazily through the air, landing softly on his coat and melting almost instantly. He didn't brush them away. You know what else? He added. I think sometimes legacy isn't even about people. It's about places. This bench, for instance. I've sat here so many times, told so many stories. Long after I'm gone, others will sit here, maybe even you, telling your own stories. And in that way, a part of me lingers, not in monuments, not in headlines, but in moments like this. The thought filled me with a strange comfort. As evening approached, the sky darkened and the lamps flickered on, casting halos of light on the snow. The world seemed both vast and intimate, as though all of Washington had narrowed to the space between two men on a bench. Ed shifted slightly, his cane tapping against the ground. I've been thinking, he said, about what it means to grow old. People fear it, you know. They see it as decline, as loss. But to me, growing old is just proof you kept going. Proof you survived long enough to tell your story. That's no small thing. His voice carried strength, even as the wind cut across them all. Of course, he added with a smile. Growing old also means you've grown every time you stand up and your doctor becomes your best friend. But that's part of the bargain. You take the aches along with the wisdom. I laughed with him, the sound warm against the cold. As the snow thickened, I realized hours had passed again without me noticing. That was the gift of Ed's company. Time bent around him, slowing to the pace of memory and reflection. When it grew too dark to ignore, I stood reluctantly. Will you be here again? I asked. He nodded, pulling his coat tighter. As long as my legs carry me, I'll be here. This bench is my anchor. And now, it seems, it's become part of your story too. We shook hands once more, his grip firm despite the gloves. Then I walked away, the crunch of snow under my boots echoing in the quiet. I glanced back once to see him still sitting, a solitary figure framed by falling snow, the lamps casting a gentle glow around him. It was an image I knew I would never forget. The story of Edward Thompson was still not finished. It was a story of war and love, of grief and survival, of benches and reflections. And as long as he sat there, the chapters would keep unfolding. I promised myself I would return again when the season turned, because some stories are not meant to be heard just once. They are meant to be lived slowly, like the turning of the year. And so, under the falling snow of Washington, D.C., the veteran's story continued, stretching far beyond the night, far beyond the city, into the hearts of those willing to stop, to listen, and to carry it forward. When spring finally arrived in Washington, D.C., it felt like the city was breathing again after holding its breath all winter. The cherry blossoms painted the streets and the mall with shades of pink and white, delicate petals floating through the air like confetti from an unseen celebration. Crowds filled the paths near the tidal basin, cameras flashing, voices carrying excitement in multiple languages. Tourists wandered beneath the trees as though walking inside a dream. I made my way through the crowd with a single destination in mind: the bench. It was April, and the air carried a gentler warmth. I wondered if Ed would still be there, if the change of season had altered his routine. But as soon as I spotted the familiar cane leaning beside the bench, I smiled. There he was, dressed in a lighter jacket now, his cap the same, his posture unchanged. The blossoms had scattered across the ground around him, and a few petals rested on his shoulders, as if nature itself had chosen him as part of the scenery. "You again," he said with a grin when I sat down. "Careful, or people will start thinking this is your bench instead of mine. Maybe we can share it," I replied, brushing petals from the seat. He laughed, that deep, genuine sound I had come to expect. "Sharing's fine, but I warn you, benches hold memories. You sit long enough, you'll start collecting ghosts." The city buzzed with spring energy. Children chased each other. Couples strolled hand in hand. Joggers weaved through the crowd. The smell of food trucks drifted over: pretzels, roasted nuts, coffee. It was a far cry from the silent winter days. But Ed didn't seem to mind the noise. He watched it all with quiet interest, as though every passerby added a note to the symphony of the city. "Funny thing about spring," he said after a while. "It makes people forget. Forget that winter was ever hard. Forget that just a few weeks ago they were shivering in their coats. It's like the blossoms wipe the slate clean." I nodded, watching a little girl try to catch falling petals in her hands. "Do you like that? The forgetting?" He tilted his head. "Depends. Some things are worth forgetting. Some things aren't. I suppose the trick is knowing which is which." His tone carried weight, and I sensed another story waiting to be told. "Take regrets, for example," he continued. "People think you should forget them, bury them under blossoms and sunshine. But regrets are teachers. They sting, sure, but they also point the way. If I hadn't regretted the years I spent avoiding my son, I'd never have picked up the phone and tried again. Regrets remind you that you can still change, at least while you're breathing." I asked if he had many regrets, though I almost feared the answer. More than I can count, he admitted. But I've learned to hold them differently. Not like chains around my neck, but like old letters in a drawer. They're there when I need to remember, but they don't define me. Margaret used to say that the past is a place you visit, not a place you live. Took me half my life to understand what she meant. The mention of his wife always softened his voice. I could almost see her in the way he spoke, as though she was still beside him, reminding him gently of the lessons he carried. A breeze stirred, scattering more petals around us. For a moment, it looked as though snow was falling again, only this time in pink and white instead of icy flakes. Ed lifted his face toward the blossoms. "This is what I want to be remembered by," he said quietly. "Not medals in a drawer, not the things I built or broke, but the way I sat here and watched the seasons turn. The way I told my stories to whoever cared enough to listen. That's how I want my grandchildren to remember me. As someone who noticed." His words lingered in the air. They carried no grandiosity, no demand for recognition, just a humble truth. "People chase big legacies," he added. "But I think noticing is underrated. Noticing your wife's laughter at breakfast. Noticing the way your kid's hand feels when they slip it into yours. Noticing the cherry blossoms before they fall. Life is mostly noticing, and if you fail at that, no achievement will save you." Silence followed, but it was the kind of silence filled with meaning rather than emptiness. Around us, the world carried on, unaware of the wisdom spoken on a simple park bench. I asked him if he ever feared being forgotten entirely. He leaned on his cane, considering. "Sometimes, yes. But then I remember something Margaret told me. She said memory isn't just about names and faces. It's about impressions. You may forget a man's name, but you remember how he made you feel. You may forget the details of a story, but you remember the warmth of the telling. So even if people forget Edward Thompson, maybe they'll remember the old man on the bench who made them pause, made them listen. That's enough for me." The crowd thinned as evening approached, the blossoms glowing faintly under the golden light. Street performers played guitars near the edge of the mall, their music drifting over like a soft soundtrack to the day. Ed shifted, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. "You know, when I was younger, I thought life was about fighting. Fighting for survival, for success, for recognition. Now I realize life is more about sitting still, letting it wash over you, and choosing which moments to carry forward. The fighting has its place, sure, but the sitting, that's where the real living happens." I stayed longer than I meant to, lost in his words, in the rhythm of the petals falling and the way the sky deepened into twilight. The lamps flickered on, casting gentle pools of light, and Ed looked almost luminous beneath them, a figure suspended between the past and the present. When it was finally time to go, I asked if he would keep coming back through the summer. "As long as I'm able," he said with a small smile. "This bench, and I still have more seasons left." We shook hands again, and as I walked away, I glanced back to see him still sitting there, framed by the blossoms, as if he were part of the story of the city itself. I realized then that the bench was no longer just his anchor. It had become mine, too. By the time summer rolled into Washington, D.C., the air had grown thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin and slows every step you take. The mall was alive with tourists in shorts and sunglasses, families spreading blankets on the grass, and vendors pushing carts of cold drinks and ice cream. The reflecting pool shimmered under the blazing sun, and the air buzzed with cicadas. I made my way back to the familiar bench, wiping sweat from my brow. And just as I hoped, there he was, Edward Thompson, still in his cap, though this time wearing a loose short-sleeved shirt and holding a bottle of water. He looked comfortable, as though no season could chase him from his place. "You're back," he said with a grin. "I was starting to wonder if the heat had scared you off." "I thought the same about you," I replied, sitting beside him. The wood was hot against my palms. He chuckled. "This bench and we've survived winters colder than bones and summers hotter than hell. A little sweat won't kill me." We watched children run barefoot on the grass, their laughter echoing against the stone monuments. The scent of hot dogs and roasted peanuts carried through the air. Somewhere nearby, a man played a saxophone, the low notes drifting lazily over the crowd. "Summer reminds me of my youth," Ed said after a while. "Back when time felt endless, and every evening meant sitting on the porch with neighbors, sipping sweet tea, talking until the stars came out. We didn't need much to be happy. Just company, just presence." I asked him what happiness meant to him now, at his age. He leaned back, folding his hands over his cane. "Happiness is simpler than people think. It's not the big wins, the promotions, the recognition. It's waking up without too much pain in the knees. It's hearing your granddaughter's voice on the phone. It's the taste of strawberries in July." People spend their lives chasing some grand definition of happiness, but the truth is, it's made of scraps. Small, ordinary scraps stitched together into something worth holding. His words settled into me like the heat itself, heavy yet undeniable. We sat for a long time in comfortable silence, broken only by the shouts of children and the rustling of trees in the hot breeze. Then Ed told me a story I hadn't heard before. "Did I ever tell you about my brother?" he asked. I shook my head. His name was Robert, 2 years younger than me. He had a laugh that could fill a room. Everyone liked him more than me, to be honest. He stayed home when I went overseas, took care of the family, worked at the factory. When I came back from the war, I was the one everyone called a hero, but truth be told, he was the real hero. He built a life, raised 3 kids, kept the family together. I carried medals in a drawer. He carried people in his arms. Ed's voice caught slightly. When Robert died, heart attack sudden, gone just like that. It hit me harder than anything the battlefield ever did, because I realized too late that I'd spent years competing with him in my head instead of telling him how proud I was. Regret, like I told you before. But now, every summer, when the cicadas hum like this, I hear his laugh, and I try to honor him by telling his story. The cicadas buzzed louder, as if in chorus. I thought of Robert then, a man I'd never met, and felt as though his presence joined us on that bench. As the day wore on, the sun dipped lower, though the air remained warm. Fireflies began to spark in the shadows of the trees, tiny lanterns blinking in rhythm. Ed leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You know what I've learned?" he said softly. "That joy and grief are not opposites. They live side by side. You can sit here laughing at the children and still feel your brother's absence. You can taste strawberries and still miss your wife's touch. That's the richness of living. It's not about replacing sorrow with joy. It's about letting them share the same table." The fireflies blinked on, the saxophone player still playing, the monuments glowing under the evening lights. It was a summer night that seemed to stretch out endlessly. When I finally stood to leave, Ed clasped my hand firmly. "Come back in the fall," he said. "That's my favorite season. Everything changes, and you feel it in your bones. It's when you remember that time doesn't wait. I promised I would." Autumn in Washington brought a completely different atmosphere. The heat faded, replaced by crisp air that smelled faintly of leaves and earth. The trees lining the mall blazed with gold, orange, and red, their colors mirrored in the reflecting pool. The city felt calmer, quieter, as though it too was taking stock of the year gone by. When I reached the bench in October, Ed was there, wrapped in a light coat. He looked thinner, more tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. "You made it," he said warmly. "Didn't think I'd let you off the hook, did you?" I laughed and sat down, pulling my own jacket tighter against the chill. "Fall has always been Margaret's season," he said. She loved the colors, the way the world seemed to burn before going quiet. She used to say autumn was proof that endings could be beautiful too. We watched as a breeze scattered leaves across the path. A child kicked them into the air, laughing as they swirled around him. "I've been thinking a lot about endings," Ed continued. "Not in a sad way, but in a real way. I don't know how many more autumns I've got left, but I do know this. I want to spend them noticing, sitting here, telling stories, watching the leaves fall. That's enough." I told him he'd already given me more than enough stories to last a lifetime. He smiled, but his voice carried a quiet seriousness. "Then promise me something. When I'm not here anymore, you'll keep coming back. Sit on this bench. Notice the seasons. Tell someone else a story. Pass it on. Because stories die if we stop telling them." I promised him. Without hesitation, the evening grew colder, the sun setting earlier now. Ed stood slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "Walk with me one more time," he said. We moved along the reflecting pool, the leaves crunching under our feet. The Lincoln Memorial glowed in the distance, steady and timeless. Ed paused halfway, looking up at the sky streaked with purple and orange. "Life's not about how many steps you take," he murmured. "It's about the pauses in between. That's where the meaning hides." His words etched themselves into me, as permanent as the stone monuments around us. We returned to the bench, and for a long time we just sat there, watching the last of the day fade into night. Neither of us spoke, because silence was enough. I didn't know then if it would be the last autumn we'd share, but I knew one thing for certain. The bench, the stories, and Edward Thompson himself had already become part of me. and as the first stars appeared in the sky, I realized that perhaps this was what legacy truly meant. Not statues, not medals, not records in books, but the way one life could quietly shape another. Winter returned to Washington, D.C. with its familiar stillness, wrapping the city in a cold that sank deep into the bones. Snow dusted the steps of the monuments, and the reflecting pool lay frozen, its surface like glass beneath the pale sky. The air was sharp, each breath visible in little clouds. The crowds of spring and summer were gone. Only the occasional tourist or bundled-up jogger passed through the mall now. I walked with careful steps, boots crunching on icy patches, until I saw the bench. At first it seemed empty, and my heart tightened, but then I noticed him. Ed was there, wrapped in a heavy coat, scarf pulled high, gloves covering his hands. His cane leaned against the bench as usual, though his posture was different, smaller somehow, as if the cold weighed on him. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, and the smile I knew so well appeared. "You made it," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Of course," I replied, sitting beside him. The wood was frozen against me, but I didn't care. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence of winter was thick, broken only by the distant flap of a flag and the muffled sound of footsteps on snow. The monuments seemed even larger in this stillness, like guardians watching over us. Finally, Ed spoke. "This may be my last winter on this bench." I turned to him quickly. "Don't say that." He chuckled softly. "I don't mean it in a sad way, just in a real way. My body's slowing down. The walk from my daughter's place to here takes longer. The cold bites harder. But that's all right. Everything has its season." His words hung in the air, as crisp as the wind. "You know," he continued, "when I was a young man, I used to think endings were failures. That if something ended, it meant I hadn't held on tightly enough. But I've learned that endings are just part of the rhythm. You can't have spring without winter. You can't have joy without loss. Life is one long series of beginnings and endings, tied together by the stories we tell in between." Snowflakes began to fall, drifting slowly onto his cap, his shoulders, the ground at our feet. I brushed one from my sleeve and watched as it melted instantly on the warmth of my skin. Ed's voice grew softer, almost like he was speaking to himself. "Margaret used to knit scarves for the children every winter. She'd sit by the fire, her hands moving like magic, and when she finished, each scarf had a little flaw in it. Not a mistake, really. Just a reminder that nothing has to be perfect to be precious. That's how I see life now. Imperfect, full of flaws, but all the more beautiful for them." I listened, memorizing every word, knowing these moments were gifts I might never receive again. "Promise me something," he said suddenly, turning to face me. His eyes were steady though tired. "Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll keep coming here. Not just for me, but for yourself. Sit, notice, tell your stories. Let this bench keep being a place of remembering. I promise," I whispered, my throat tight. He nodded, satisfied. "But because stories don't belong to just one person. They're like rivers. They keep flowing, long after the storyteller is gone." We sat together as the snow fell heavier, the world around us turning white. The lights flickered on, casting a golden glow across the frozen pool. In that quiet, I felt time itself pause, as if the city was holding its breath for us. After a long silence, Ed said one last thing. "If this is the last winter I sit here, then I'm glad I'm not sitting alone." I placed my hand gently over his gloved one. "You're not." The snow fell thicker, softening every sound, every edge, until the world felt like a dream. And there we remained, two figures on a bench in Washington, D.C., bound together not by blood or obligation, but by stories, by seasons, by the simple act of noticing. I didn't know if I would see him again in spring, but I knew that even if the bench was empty, his presence would never leave. The stories he had given me were already alive within me, waiting to be passed on, waiting to find new ears, new hearts. And as I walked away into the white night, I realized that Edward Thompson had given me the greatest gift of all. Not answers, not instructions, but a way of seeing, a way of living. The bench would always be there. The stories would always return. And in every season, I would come back. As the evening shadows stretched long across the streets of Washington, D.C., the air seemed quieter than it had been all afternoon. The bustling city, with its sirens, conversations, and hurried footsteps, began to settle into the rhythm of twilight. We walked together with Arthur until we reached the corner where our paths were meant to diverge. He stopped, leaned slightly on his cane, and turned to us with a faint smile. His eyes, though tired, still carried a spark that refused to fade. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice wasn't grand or theatrical, but it carried weight, the kind of gratitude that comes from a place deep within, not for listening to an old man ramble, but for letting me remember who I was, and for reminding me I am still someone, even today. We wanted to say more, to promise we'd see him again, to assure him that his story mattered. But words suddenly felt too small. So we nodded, and he nodded back, the silence between us saying more than any sentence could. As he crossed the street slowly, blending into the crowd of strangers, we felt the city change around us. The monuments and memorials we had admired earlier now seemed different. Less like cold stone and more like living reminders of people like Arthur. People whose sacrifices had shaped the very ground beneath our feet. We lingered there for a while, watching the stream of traffic lights flicker on, thinking about how often we pass by others without knowing the worlds they carry inside. A bench in the heart of Washington had given us not just a story, but a truth. That sometimes history doesn't live only in books or museums, but in the quiet voices of those willing to share a piece of themselves, if only we stop long enough to listen. And as the night finally settled over the Capitol, we carried Arthur's memory with us, certain that his voice would never truly fade.